Okay, hi everyone. Today we have a new guest on our show. It's a well-known journalist, Matthew Fulco. Welcome to the show, Matthew.
Thank you, Richard. Glad to be here.
Good. Please tell us a few words about yourself, and then I would ask you a few questions.
Sure. Well, I've worked in Taiwan since 2014 as a journalist covering the intersection of technology and geopolitics. And in the past few years, it's been an exciting time to write about Taiwan, with the cross-strait relationship becoming more tense. That gives us, people like us, more to write and more to talk about. And I'm especially interested in looking carefully at what's happening in Taiwan's politics as we get closer to the election in 2024. And I'm currently working on this topic for Japan Times, Economist Intelligence Unit, MCHAIM, and some other publications, MCHAIM Taiwan.
Thank you, Matthew. I would start with a question. In recent weeks or even months, we heard a few dates regarding apparently China's attack on Taiwan, and we probably would have to wait until maybe elections next year in Taiwan and US. What do you think about it? About all these dates that we hear from different, from military, from civilians? And also the second question would be, which outcome do you think would be more important for the CCP? The first elections in Taiwan or the second ones at the end of the year in the US?
Well, Richard, those are two very good questions. In a report we did in MCHAIM last fall, or December to be precise, we looked at those dates in some detail and gave some reasons why I gave some reasons why I don't think that there's going to be there's no imminent attack on Taiwan. I think that the PRC remains committed to peaceful reunification, as they say, and the reason for that is the costs of doing otherwise would be too high. I don't think that there's any evidence that's been given that suggests the PRC is planning to attack Taiwan on any specific timeline. The only date that we know of with some certainty that's come from US intelligence is that Xi Jinping wants the PLA ready to attack Taiwan by 2027. We've heard that from the director of the CIA. So we can assume that they have good reason to come to that conclusion, but that doesn't tell us anything about the intent of the Chinese leadership. And if we look at how the Chinese leadership's been interacting with Taiwan's opposition party, the Kuomintang, we can see that they seem committed to reopening cross-strait exchanges on the basis of the 92 consensus, which is how they interacted with Taiwan during Ma Ying-jeou's administration. I think we're going to see increasing efforts by the PRC to engage with the opposition and present the opposition as the better choice for Taiwan's people because it's able to engage with the PRC, and the DPP is not, because the PRC won't talk with them. As far as the elections go, I don't think that the US election will have any real bearing on what China decides to do with regards to Taiwan. I don't think that US domestic politics plays a role in China's calculations about how it should deal with Taiwan, whether peacefully or otherwise. I think that's something that US commentators and analysts worry about because they have reason perhaps to be concerned about certain elements of domestic politics in the United States. But for something the size of a Taiwan operation, a military operation, I don't think that PRC is going to be looking at who's in the White House at that time. I think Taiwan.
But that the Kuomintang had this chance before. I mean, Ma Ying-jeou was 2 terms in power and it didn't work back then. Now I think the society here is even more against any kind of annexation or whatever someone might call it, unification. The agreement was during Ma Ying-jeou that he promoted, or he campaigned on an economical approachment, but not a political one. And once he went too far, we had protests. So I would challenge you here and say that we might have the same situation now, or even more advanced, that people might say, yes, economic cooperation maybe, but I don't see a chance for any, like, how could the Kuomintang introduce or bring Taiwan closer to China? They had a chance. It didn't work back then.
So are you asking how they would present that in an election platform?
Yeah, how could they do it? I mean, no, let's say they get elected. How could they
Okay.
do it and make this that's such a situation palpable and, attractive to Taiwanese? They're even less convinced to it than a decade ago.
I agree that there isn't a real straightforward political solution, but I tend to be looking more at how they're going to position themselves in this election. I think they'll be focusing probably on where people are unhappy with the ruling party, and they're going to try to say that they'll be better economic stewards and that they'll be able to handle the cross-strait relationship more responsibly. But whether or not that works really will depend on if they can offer something to Taiwan's people that's acceptable from a political standpoint. I agree that the 92 consensus is really questionable at this point because it was rejected by voters several times, and Xi Jinping in early 2019 seemed to equate it with one country, two systems, which has almost no support in Taiwan except from a very small pro-unification constituency, which perhaps Hong Shou-ju, the former KMT chairperson and presidential candidate, represents. But outside of that constituency rather, it doesn't have any support. So I think that it's going to depend on how the KMT positions itself and if voters feel that the DPP's policies are leading them in a direction that's too dangerous. I think with Taiwanese, it often comes down to a pragmatic calculation about who's going to maintain the status quo most effectively. I think if you look at most surveys still now, most voters, a plurality, are in favor of the status quo, with some variations along the lines of what that means exactly. But it'll be, if the DPP is going to win, they're going to have to present themselves as able to uphold that and not push Taiwan in a direction that looks like conflict might be around the corner. The challenge for the DPP is to not present itself, so rather the KMT is to not come across as surrendering Taiwan's sovereignty, because there's no support for that.
Okay, good. I would like to ask you for a few comments about the little known fact outside of Taiwan. I know you wrote about this before on LinkedIn about the likely DPP candidate Lai and his visit in Shanghai in 2014. Maybe you could talk about this a little bit, so also our foreign audience knows a bit more about his visit in China at the Fudan University.
Yes, well, I've watched a short video and read a bit about it. Essentially, he was going, my understanding is at the time he was not, I mean, he was in Tainan local government and was visiting to help out with an art exhibition of somebody who was appreciated on both sides of the strait. That was common back then, as you remember. There was a lot of different cross-strait exchanges in those days, and art was something that there was some exchanges between the two palace museums in Taipei and Beijing, and he was going for that purpose to help out with this art exhibition. He was then asked to speak, my understanding is at Fudan University, and posed a few questions to him that were challenging about Taiwan independence, and he answered them fairly deftly. He made the case that Taiwan had to decide its own future, but he didn't himself seem to be in favor of Taiwan independence. Obviously, he was in front of a PRC audience there and was mindful of that. But I think that we need to look at his willingness to visit China at the time and how he responded to those questions, and then compare that with this statement that's been controversial about being a practical worker for Taiwan independence in 2017, and ask ourselves, is this somebody who can handle the cross-strait relationship responsibly? I would think that, having been to China and having been in front of a PRC audience like that, that suggests to me the willingness to go, the ability to answer the questions effectively, come across as somebody who's very much knowledgeable about the cross-strait relationship and knew what to say in that situation makes me think that he'd be capable of handling it as well as anybody in the KMT. I think that there isn't really a need to be overly concerned about that. Whether he's the right person for the job for a number of other reasons, and whether the voters are happy with how the DPP's handled the pandemic, economics, housing prices, these things that we know are often very important in national elections, is another story. But I think for cross-strait relations, we don't need to be concerned about Lai Ching-te's capabilities.
Okay, thanks. So there is another kind of related question. There is a lot of discussion, both in Taiwan and in the foreign media among experts. How would the Taiwanese then behave or react to an invasion or a military attack? And people say they would defend Taiwan, others they wouldn't. So my question would be now, after the extended conscription, what else do you think could the government do to maybe make to help Taiwanese to come to the conclusion that they should defend the country, maybe, teach them a few skills. I will give an example. I had a Rick Fisher on my show, and he came up with an idea. He said that what Taiwanese government could do, they could, buy a lot of rifles, weapons, teach the society, the populace to use them, and then store them in, for example, in police precincts. And then this would raise the bar for China, because then, let's say in a few years after such exercises, they would face a population, few million men who, able to shoot and also having rifles. What do you think? What could the Taiwanese government also do to, raise the bar for China?
Well, I think there's been, Rick is somebody I've interviewed for my stories on numerous occasions, and he's always a great source for ideas about how to strengthen Taiwan's resilience from a defense standpoint. That's an interesting idea. Where, having lived in Taiwan for a while, where I wonder about that is just, at what point does Taiwanese society accept that it's time to rearm fully? Because we know that in the martial law era that society was heavily militarized, and that there's still a lingering shadow from that autocratic experience, right? From 1947 until 1987, when martial law was lifted. So do we have the wherewithal to, I think getting the rifles is one thing, but are people really going to want to do that? And what's the justification for that? The justification is to be prepared, but it's a very delicate line that they tread from a political standpoint. I think Rick is probably right from a security standpoint. But one of the problems with Taiwan's defense is always the political angle. That's what happened with conscription all this time, right? It was actually during Chen Shui-bian's administration, who's DPP, when it was slashed considerably, and then I believe it was later Ma Ying-jeou that 4 months effectively came into effect. And DPP hesitated for a long time due to electoral considerations. Finally, I think they did the right thing. Politicians don't always do what's right or what's courageous. Certainly, the Tsai administration made the right decision from a defense and resilience standpoint. And it seems it does have support in Taiwan society, but it's very interesting to look at who supports it more. I'll be interested to see some more comprehensive polling, because from what I've seen, not younger people are actually the ones who are less excited about the idea.
Yeah.
So as far as society, though, I think that there's some Alexander Huang, who I interviewed for recently, the KMT's director of international affairs. He suggested that that Taiwanese government try to train people with certain drills. They already have air raid drills. He suggested that the government perhaps do something where the internet is cut off for a certain amount of time, or where petrol is not available for a certain amount of time, and see how people manage that. And I think that that's speaking to the idea that there may not be all of a sudden a full-on invasion of Taiwan. There might be something that they turn on and off, not necessarily a full blockade, but it could be some kind of interruption that happens. I think they showed after the Pelosi visit, they have that capability perhaps to do something to that effect. I'm not saying that's their intent, the PRC's intent, but the Taiwanese government could start with something that's not necessarily directly military training, but resilience training so that people are able to cope without, if you think about modern society, and Taiwan is not an exception in this regard, we're always on our phones, on the mobile internet, and it would be interesting to see, you know, how can Taiwan deal with the internet being cut? How could Taiwan deal with fuel shortages, you know, food shortages, water shortages? These kinds of things might be a good first step before we start putting rifles in everyone's hand. You know, there's an interesting argument about the, I want to say the city fighting or fighting on the ground in Taiwan for cities. It's on the one side of the argument is if it reaches that point, it doesn't look good for Taiwan. On the other side of the argument is you need people to be ready no matter what. You know, it's true if China's made that kind of headway and we're, you know, there's hand-to-hand combat around the capital in Kaohsiung, you know, in various places in Taiwan, that's already not an optimistic scenario, but I would have to agree that you have to be prepared.
Actually, the idea you just mentioned from Alexander Huang, I like it a lot, because if you're saying that they wouldn't go for a kinetic attack, no military invasion, yeah, then they might cut off the internet, you know, have a blockade around Taiwan, and in that situation.
My understanding of that, and we spoke about it in some detail, is that the idea of a full blockade, once you've implemented something on that level, that you can simply dial that down, it's not necessarily straightforward, because blockade can be considered an act of war. The U.S. could blockade the Strait of Malacca without too much difficulty and put China in a tough situation without firing, you know, without any shots being fired. And at that point, it's getting pretty complicated. But there are things China could do where it falls far short of that. And I think that's what the Pelosi, what their response to the Pelosi visit was about in part. Obviously, they were training and they wanted to show their capabilities, their joint strike capabilities and training. But those shipping routes that they told to be aware that they could, it was a little bit vague. And we've heard different things about what was rerouted and what wasn't, but it didn't interrupt anything in too it wasn't too large a disruption by any means. But I think the signaling was there that it could be in the future. I do think that, again, we don't have the intent at this point, but the capability, I believe, is there. The People's Liberation Army, Navy, to disrupt shipping traffic or to interfere with the internet. The Chinese have that capability. So Taiwan does need to be thinking about comprehensive resilience, and it's not just about weapons acquisition. I'm not downplaying the importance of having certain systems in place to defend Taiwan, but you do need to be thinking about it holistically.
You just mentioned Nancy Pelosi. You just left Taiwan and now you're in the US. What do you think about Kevin McCarthy's possible visit? Like, what do you think? Because a lot of people are saying now that since he feels stronger in his position, he might not go as much overboard as last time, and maybe he might, you know, the reaction might not be as strong as before. What do you think?
Well, let's talk about this from several perspectives. First, to directly respond to your question, I don't think it's in the Chinese interest to react very harshly to that if their goal is to get somebody elected whom they think they can work with towards their annexation of Taiwan, which they would call peaceful reunification, right? But they've shown in the past that they misjudge these situations time and again. So I don't think we can be certain at all that they'll act rationally, because we don't know what it is that they feel they must show to a domestic audience. However, if Xi is more secure, which we should believe he is, than prior to clinching his third term, it would make sense that there is a reaction, but it's not on the same scale. Whether China will distinguish between the fact that Pelosi and President Joe Biden, are in the same party and McCarthy is not. He's a Republican, and he might even be visiting Taiwan to we don't know what kind of domestic political calculations are involved. It's unclear if the PRC would take that into account. I think it's more important that Xi's position is better consolidated than it was by far than it was when Pelosi visited. That said, I think it's important for any U.S. politicians to be mindful of Taiwan's democratic process and to take into consideration how a visit at a specific time could potentially impact the election. And I think it's important from a U.S. government standpoint to be neutral, agnostic on Taiwan's election, other than they expect it to be free and fair, and otherwise not to be perceived as doing anything that might have some kind of impact on the election. I think that I've heard that Kevin McCarthy may consider visiting next year in early 2024. I think that would be a prudent decision. I think that this isn't just about Kevin McCarthy, any somewhat a senior U.S. politician who visits Taiwan, let's say in December of 2023, it's going to be interpreted differently than if that person makes a visit after the election's over. If that makes sense to you.
Yes, that does make a lot of sense. My last question would be like a summary, because you've been a few years ago in China, you've lived
Yes.
quite some time in Taiwan. Now you're back in the US. Could you tell me like a little bit, how do you see it from each, when you spoke to the Chinese, Taiwanese, and now in the US? What's the different point of view? Like how would you say all those three parties see the same problem? What's their attitude? What kind of differences do you see?
Sure. Well, we can start with the PRC's attitude.
Okay.
I think that just from my conversations with professionals in Shanghai, working professionals, you get the sense that people in China think that the PRC, especially during the Ma Ying-jeou era, really was generous to Taiwan, and they look at it from an economic perspective. And they say, well, there were agreements signed, and Taiwan's agricultural sector is benefited. They really like, Taiwanese agricultural products. I mean, that's something that comes up, right? And when there were more cross-strait exchanges, visiting Taiwan, buying all the food, buying the pineapple cakes, this kind of thing, and they feel like, well, China's the biggest market. This is just for agricultural products, and we've opened up to them, and we sent tourists we have the biggest tourist market, and we sent them to Taiwan, and this benefited Taiwan's society and economy. Now, it's true they're no longer the biggest market, but at the time, the Chinese market still was. When I had this conversation, I think it was 2017. So there's that perspective that China's been generous, and that at least the DPP is not grateful. So that's one way that it's perceived there. That I think that we often hear about how Taiwan provokes a visceral reaction in China, and that's true. That people will defend the Chinese Communist Party's official viewpoint on Taiwan, and say that every Chinese would fight for Taiwan. You do get a lot of that, but I think it's important to look at it from the practical economic standpoint and see why they might feel why they have this kind of negative sentiment. But they don't, I don't think, have a negative sentiment overall about Taiwan, especially because there have been a lot of exchanges. But about perhaps the ruling party's policies and its attitude, I would say that they feel that you are ungrateful because we gave you all these economic benefits and you won't agree to even this simple framework that the prior administration agreed to. And that's another thing. I think for them, they feel that once Taiwan elected Ma Ying-jeou and the 92 consensus was the modus vivendi that was used, they have a hard time understanding how that can be discarded. Right, because if we look at one country, two systems now, maybe Xi Jinping is going to put Wang Huning in charge of coming up with an alternative, perhaps. But we look at through all those Chinese leaders from Deng Xiaoping on, how long that idea lasted, that concept lasted. It's still in place in Hong Kong officially. So I don't think in China they don't kind of casually come up with ideas like that and then or political models and then simply put them aside. Taiwan has a vibrant democracy. China needs to understand that. I think on some level they probably do, but they don't like it. Right. So now from the U.S. perspective, I think that, you know, the U.S. has the Taiwan Relations Act that governs relations between the U.S. and Taiwan that requires the U.S. to provide Taiwan with the means to defend itself. And I think there's also the One China policy that the U.S. has that acknowledges the PRC's position that Taiwan is a part of China, but the U.S. has never officially signed off on that. Of course, the Chinese version of that says, right, I believe it says 承认, and that could be translated to recognize, but the U.S. insisted on acknowledge because there's a difference in English. But I think we also need to look at the changing nature of cross-strait relations and U.S.-China relations. And, you know, when China and the U.S. had a more cordial relationship and Ma Ying-jeou was president of Taiwan, we saw a very different U.S.-Taiwan relationship as well. I think it was still a good relationship, but it wasn't nearly as close on defense and on these sort of visible high-level exchanges. Where I'd like to segue just for a moment would be on, you know, is the U.S. cognizant of the very real possibility that the DPP might not be in power in 2024, and how would it deal with the KMT or other opposition administration that's in favor of closer ties with China when U.S.-China ties have become much more adversarial? I think that's something crucial for policymakers in Washington to consider. Regardless of what their preference is, they need to look at Taiwan's democracy, which, you know, like many democracies, it's a bit like a pendulum. I think, as we've discussed before, it swings from one side to the other. And DPP's been in power for 8 years. You know, there's a real chance that an opposition politician will win in 2024. So that would be the U.S. perspective. I think from Taiwan's perspective, as you mentioned earlier, there is really very little support for this idea of a greater China or a Chinese entity with the PRC as the highest authority and Taiwan subordinate to that. I would say that's got very little. The only prominent Taiwanese politician I can think of who, you know, will stand up and say that she's in favor of this is Hong Shou-ju, whom we discussed earlier. And, you know, there might be perhaps, you know, 3 to 5% or 6% of Taiwanese in favor of unification, and the rest are not. So when we talk about the status quo, though, there's a spectrum of that, and that's where it gets tricky with the election, because I think for most Taiwanese, they want to be left alone. You know, they don't want to declare independence and go down that road because they know that it could lead to a very tense situation. You know, on the other hand, they've seen what's happened to Hong Kong. I guess we should say Macau as well, although Macau went along with it. But Hong Kong and Macau both are under one country, two systems, and they don't have the freedoms that they understood they would have under one country, two systems. So for Taiwanese, the question really is, how do we maintain the status quo, not let China encroach too much further, because they've started to encroach more, and hold out for however long it takes until they stop trying to force us to be a part of the PRC, the political entity. I think, you know, it's been, 73 years since the the official end, almost 72 and a half since the official end of the Chinese Civil War. Of course, it's not complete, it's not formally over, but the main fighting ended. So how does Taiwan hold out? Who can help? Which candidate can help Taiwan be resilient and hold out and not be absorbed by the PRC, but at the same time, not put Taiwan in a situation where it has to make a decision about fighting or not? I think that most people want to avoid that. It's a separate question you posed earlier about what would they do. But I think that the vast majority wants, certainly from my conversations, my research over many years, people want to avoid that situation. And to the degree that US cooperation with the US and recognition by other democracies helps them raise their profile and deter China from any kind of military adventurism, I think they're very much in favor of that. So I agree with you that the KMT is saying, well, let's back away from the democratic world and embrace China so that China doesn't force us to make a difficult decision. I don't think there's a lot of support for that. So that's going to be a challenge for whoever is the KMT candidate in 2024. And if Taiwan People's Party also fields a candidate, whether that's independently or even together with the KMT, they need to really be thinking about that.
Yeah, I like the idea very much that you mentioned here, explain from the Chinese side, the lack of gratefulness as they perceive it from Taiwan. That's really interesting. I didn't think about that, but that's probably how they see it. And they don't maybe understand, if they consider that's only a minority here supporting, independent Taiwan and everybody wants really use China, then that's really confusing for them. And they might think that it's only the US that's holding them away from, Taiwanese embracing China. I think that's a great idea you just mentioned.
Well, I think that it's important to try to see things from their perspective, because that certainly from Taiwan's standpoint, they watch China very closely and they have a lot of engagement, or they did. Sorry, and those CCP-KMT channels appear to be reopening. To the extent that those channels might circumvent that, well, let's say that in some cases they certainly appear to be circumventing Taiwan's elected government, I think that certainly can be problematic. On the other hand, is it better to have no dialogue at all? And I think that's what the KMT is trying to pitch. They're saying that, well, this is China's decision. We need to work with it. We need to have dialogue. The DPP is saying we want dialogue, but we will not accept the 92 consensus. And to be honest, I think each one of those core positions is problematic, because Taiwan does need to be having dialogue with China, but it needs to be with the elected government, and China shouldn't be imposing this kind of precondition on Taiwan. They always talk about sincerity, right? You're not sincere, they say. The DPP authorities are not sincere because they don't accept the 92 consensus. And I think that that's not accurate. I think the DPP, Tsai Ing-wen certainly has been sending out signals that Taiwan doesn't want to go to war. It's preparing itself. It's going to defend itself, but it's not being provocative. I think that's a message that's been being sent out. So, but at the same time, it's really challenging for Taiwan, because they do need to find a way to lower tensions with China, but they don't want to be put in a position where they have to agree to something politically that compromises their sovereignty and constricts their options. That's the challenge. There doesn't appear to be a candidate who can solve, whose platform resolves all those conflicting issues. But sometimes in Taiwan's politics, it'll be interesting to see to what degree, besides cross-strait relations, other issues command voters' attention during this campaign. Because in my view, the more that non-cross-strait issues dominate, the better the chance the KMT is going to have, because there's a lot of discontent with various policies the DPP has implemented. I would say We look at many governments during the pandemic, and they've, you know, the ruling party has been voted out of office. I think that it's happened in it happened in Australia recently, right? And it's not just a problem for Taiwan, or if it wasn't the case of the party in Japan, but of course there was a change in leadership. Well, first when Abe stepped down, but then his successor. And now we're not sure if Taiwan is going to be able to, if the DPP is going to be able to make a strong case for itself to continue based on its economic record or its pandemic record, and these issues like housing prices and things that, inflation's effect on people's wages. I just think it's important that we don't ignore these issues, because for Taiwanese voters, it's not just about cross-strait relations.
Yeah.
Cross-strait relations are crucial, but people really do look holistically at the candidate and what the candidate is offering and how the candidate is going to address their concerns. And we need to look at Taiwan's economy and look at, how people feel about the pandemic policy. And I think there was a lot of controversy about Taiwan's home vaccines developed domestically. There's a scandal going on right now with regards to medicine. This is something that Taiwanese voters really don't like, when there appears to be some kind of malfeasance that's occurred with people using political influence to help their business prospects. We don't have evidence, but we know that people have been brought in for questioning. I would expect the KMT to bring that up for sure during the campaign, and to campaign pretty negatively against the DPP for issues like this, for the economy, which was doing very well during the pandemic, but is now, Taiwan's economy is export dependent. It's cyclical. I wouldn't say that it's anything the DPP did very wrong. The KMT, when Ma Ying-jeou was in office, had the same problem. But when you're dependent on exports, and you talk about innovation, but you're still dependent on the same core industries, when demand falls, that's going to affect your economy. So domestic consumption, though, still looks to be holding up. So that could be, a factor that works in favor. But certainly the export cycle and headline GDP appears to be falling. We shouldn't assume that people are only going to look at cross-strait relations when they vote, right?
Matthew. Yeah, that's great. Very interesting. Yeah, that would be it. Thank you very much for your time. It was really interesting. I liked it a lot.
Yeah, thank you, Richard. Thank you, and glad to be on the show and to talk about these topics. Thank you again.